So good morning. My name is John Engeler and I'm the CEO of Shelter New South Wales and also the Chair of National Shelter, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to this concurrent session, Disruption and Displacement, Addressing Homelessness Caused by Major Events. Before we begin, of course, we'd like to acknowledge that we are acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. And I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and their contribution that they make to the life of this city and region. Also importantly, at the Ahuri events, we always want to make sure that we acknowledge the people who have lived experience in housing vulnerability, who are here at the conference either as presenters or delegates. Your experiences play a vital role in shaping better housing outcomes for the future. And so thanks especially to Mission Australia, who've provided the sponsored delegate partnership program to allow that. Just with some housekeeping today, as per these sessions, we'll start with presentation from these three extraordinary professionals who I'll introduce in a moment. Then we'll have a panel session to ask some questions of each of them and of each other. And then most importantly, I think increasingly at these conferences, the opportunity for you to ask some questions of the panel from the audience. So looking forward to that. So just setting the scene, we often think about somehow that things are going to stay the same. They're not. Disruption and change is the uncertainty we know is going to happen for us. Thinking about it today, I think we can put them into three categories and the presenters will sort of reflect on that. Some things are known knowns. We know that we do redevelopment, and Humair, Ahmad will talk from Homes New South Wales about a business as usual approach, but to disruption and displacement. We also have unknown knowns, and Jackson Hills from QShelter, my colleague there, is going to talk about the Olympics and what that means for the city and Queensland in particular. So preparing for something which will cause disruption, but we know about it. And then finally, and quite importantly, Elly, the CEO of Resilience Lismore, will talk about what we might call the unknown unknowns. That is what to do in cases of emergency, things that we can't really plan for 100%, but we know will also happen. So without any further ado, I'll welcome Humair to the presentation panel so he can talk from Homes New South Wales about Waterloo in particular. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everyone. The focus of my presentation is on disruption and displacement caused by urban renewal of a social housing estate, and I'll present an example of a major redevelopment that we are undertaking in the centre of Sydney, in Waterloo. As John said, that this is like a fairly BAU thing that happens. I think all jurisdictions are undertaking large-scale renewals. I know Victoria is doing a lot of redevelopment of tower blocks. Waterloo is a similar sized and type estate. And the challenge for housing agencies is how to minimize the impact on tenants and how we can make that change process smoother. And of course, when that kind of a change happens at that scale, there is a lot of angst, there's a lot of anxiety, and how you can work with communities, engage with them appropriately, provide the right advice at the right time to make that journey a bit smoother. So I'll take you through a set of slides. But before I do that, I just wanted to mention that we in New South Wales, Homes New South Wales has a very long history of renewal of estates. We've done a lot of broad acre renewals that were outside on the outskirts of town, those traditional Radburn estates. And they, of course, have a different set of challenges, and then we have done inner city ones as well. And the one example I'll use today is of that. So without further ado, and one more thing before I start is that the approach is rooted in our ethos of client-centric service delivery. So since the creation of Homes New South Wales more than 18 months ago, we have rebalanced, refocused our attention on how we can be more client-centric. There's a whole community development function, tenant engagement function we've created in-house. So all of this work that I'll present in a moment is rooted in that ethos. So just a contextual slide on the precinct itself. And as you can see, the purple bits are where the renewal will happen. And we are focusing on Waterloo South, and the kind of more purple, darker, I'm struggling with the color. Is that the darker purple? I can't think of the name of that color. It's not coming to me. And that's stage one of Waterloo South, where the main redevelopment happened. And there are certain precincts in that broader precinct that, which are not up for redevelopment for at least another 10 years. But we made a conscious decision to start engaging the broader community. Once the announcement happened, you have to, to get them engaged in the process irrespective. but letting them know that, reassuring them they don't have to sort of like start doing anything just yet. So in terms of, again, a context, 728 tenants in Waterloo South, that little precinct that was the darker purple, and more than 1,000 households. And as I said before, because it's such a massive undertaking, of course, it'll happen in stages. Again, everybody will receive a notice 6 months in advance of the move, be given the opportunity to stay in the area, local area. We have an entire relocations team that supports these kinds of endeavors. And then, of course, anybody who is moving out has a right of return. Now, obviously, redevelopment takes a long time, and often tenants are, once they're resettled, they're quite, they're in their new homes and they form their own communities there and don't want to come back to where they were moved from, but the option is available for tenants to come back if they want to. And then, as I said before, some tenants, so it's a staged project, and that we've been very upfront and transparent about what the stages are and when people move. So that, again, is that bit of information going out. So the process has started. A lot of the stakeholder briefings have happened. Notification to tenants in stage 1 in that little dark purple area, they have been notified. So this is quite a live thing that's happening now. So I might skip over some of the detail because I'm actually on the slides, you'll see like our communication plans, our collateral we've developed in terms of engagement and communication. So in terms of summary of the approach, okay. So one of the objectives really were the timely, consistent, and regular messaging. So I think regularity is also very important. That forms that engagement loop with the tenants. And not just the community itself, the broader community and the broader stakeholders, because like any inner city neighborhood, there's like a lot of existing social infrastructure and social capital. And that has been built over many, many years because these are long-standing communities, established communities. So how we can actually engage with all of that, build positive relationships with stakeholders and tenants. And also not just get input, but have a real engagement of the tenants and their lived experience into the renewal process. And generally, broadly in the inner Sydney community, what kind of awareness we provide generally to the public about the renewal project. Obviously, we've had a lot of support from City of Sydney Council. There is a lot of positivity. We haven't received any major complaints from tenants. So I think that, again, is a testament to the fact that we've done what we think we've done. We've had the right approach in our engagement so that we haven't had any major issues to date. So this is kind of and I won't kind of go through the detail of that, but this is kind of giving you the summary of activities, like, in terms of briefings, meetings with communities, barbecues, other community events, opening up Waterloo Connect, like a little presence there full-time with Homes New South Wales staff. Of course, internal briefings, a whole heap of communication to tenants and stakeholders, various information sessions. So that's kind of like giving you an activity summary. I think the next slide is also some of the detail on communication material. So the communication collateral was quite extensive, and I'll actually show you a few of the examples of that. In terms of the material going out, detailed advice on relocation and support. Letters, of course, we developed lots of letters for different stages. Relocation fact sheets so that tenants know exactly, what's happening when and what they need to do, how they will be supported. Also using all kinds of media, not just, flyers and pamphlets, but also videos and other electronic means of communication, posters, all of these kinds of communication materials. So this just gives you a sample of some of the collateral we've developed. And it is graphic, it is easy to understand, it is kind of like, it's deliberately meant to be that way so that people understand, with spatial awareness as well, the maps and where things are, where the precincts are. So that has been quite successful. More collateral, I'm skipping through some of the slides in terms of, what was the information for Waterloo North and Central tenants. So the previous one was more for the focus for the precinct that is about to be redeveloped. And also for tenants, like step by step, what's the relocation process? How do you navigate this process? What will happen at what stage? It is like, I can probably go into detail. I'm just trying to read through the screen, John. Eyesight is not that good. But yes, like it's self-explanatory. I don't need to read this, but it is a step-by-step process. So tenant support. So I think this is a very important slide because this is talking about how we've given the tenant the agency and the decision on what kind of support they want. So there's a whole heap of support available, and we make that, information available to people, and then it's driven by the tenant on what kind of support they need. So is it personal supports, is it, what the relocation team can do for you, what the support services are. It empowers the tenants to make a call on what kind of support they want. It acknowledges the diverse complexities and vulnerabilities of the tenants may have. Some might just need like a referral to some agencies. Others with more complex need might have a more intensive support organized for them. It acknowledges the existing formal and informal support networks many tenants already have in place. As I said before, these are very established communities, fully embedded in the local area. There are support networks, there are community activities happening already. So how can we leverage that? How can we build on that? And if people are already connected and don't need that level of deep support, then we just encourage them to keep on engaging with those services. Also, additional supports which respond to feedback from tenants and stakeholders. So as I said before, we've done a lot of sessions in terms of garnering feedback from the community, and that has helped us come up with what might be needed in terms of support services. And also, I think this kind of a flexible approach, client-centric approach, enables you to dial up the support and dial it down as and when needed for different people. So, okay, I'm being told to hurry up, so I'll rush through the next few slides. So this slide is just telling us about the various relocation roles we've created. These are employees of Homes New South Wales. They are specific relocation officers. They are then relocation support specialists who are who are providing. They're similar to the tenancy specialists where there's more complex clients and who need more support. So there are some specific roles there. We have an Aboriginal relocation support specialist because we have a significant Aboriginal population in Waterloo. Again, they're all employees. So one of the things I said before is that we've brought a lot of these functions in-house. We're creating a strong community development and tenant engagement function in-house. And then, of course, there are other independent support roles like a community development worker, tenant advocates. They're independent, and then they are also encouraged to support the tenants through this journey. So in terms of relocation support, we are looking at home improvements. So as you all know, with approval of the agency, people sometimes make changes to their houses. So whatever changes they made to the house and now they're relocating from the house, we make sure that we replace or reimburse for any depreciated value of the approved improvements made to the property. A mail redirection, we pay for all mail redirection, packing, unpacking, providing additional assistance when needed to help tenants with packing or unpacking. Utilities reconnection, that's also a cost, and we make that cost available. Sometimes some clients where they are hoarding and other issues, of course, decluttering, rubbish removal, companion animal boarding during the actual move. If some pets need to be boarded, we provide that. Travel, Opal cards or taxi vouchers for when alternative housing is being viewed by tenants. So obviously, as I said before, all tenants will be rehoused in the same area. So they don't have to, like if people are connected to, their children's school and other networks, we want to maintain them. So relocation is happening in the same area, but they do have to go for viewing, so we provide transport for that. And then of course, they're interpreters. We have a very diverse community. Wherever interpreting services are needed, we provide that as well. And then this is my last slide, and this is the Waterloo Connect office. It's open full-time since mid-February. It provides a central location for information about relocations, confidential meetings between tenants and support and team members, information about community activities, support services. Because if you have a presence in the area where this renewal is happening, it provides a lot of co-location opportunities for services to come in and use that space. So we've created that little hub that encourages, alignment and collaboration. So I think, John, with that, I'll end my presentation. Thank you.
So keep those questions for after the session. We'll have plenty of time again. The panel will ask each other questions, but really important that you have the opportunity. Think of those questions now for Humair. We'll get you to ask them in a little while. I'd now like to introduce Jackson Hills, my colleague again from QShelter, to talk specifically about a known unknown, which is the Olympics coming up for them in Queensland. Jackson.
Thank you. A little bit of a mic check, hopefully that's okay. And thank you, Humair, for kicking us off there. And I like John's framing of unknown unknowns, or known unknowns and known knowns. This is definitely a known unknown. So we've got this major event happening in Queensland in 2032. I'm sure you've heard of it, the Olympic and Paralympic Games, and we're all very excited about it. But the known part is that we know that these mega events coming into our housing system that's already struggling in Australia and in Queensland will have additional impacts across the housing system, and will impact different households in different ways, and will impact the system in different ways. So that's the why for us on this particular project. Just want to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which we speak and meet today, and acknowledge from the previous presentation that this land was never ceded, and we've got lots of progress to make in these areas. And there is also a First Nations lens that we're taking to the work that we're doing with this project in Queensland as well. So items for us to cover in this presentation today. So what we're really looking at, I'm going to end with what we're actually tracking and monitoring, and talk to you about how that's kind of manifesting, how that's been useful in the policy and investment space in Queensland. But before I get to that, looking to sort of just quickly recap on the Australian context with major events like the Olympic and Paralympic Games or the Commonwealth Games. We've had experience with these events before. Touch on that. We'll also look abroad, and most recently in Paris, where we hosted the Olympic and Paralympic Games. LA is next. And I'm sure you've heard lots of media reporting around both of those events and the impacts that were experienced in those locations in different ways. And of course, various judgment calls and value calls being made on the different policy approaches being taken. So we'll reflect on some of that in the short time we've got. And then, as I said, I'll look at the Brisbane context towards the end. So I'm going to fly through these next couple pretty quickly. 1956 Olympic Games in Melbourne. I guess if you were to look at it through the eyes of legacy and housing, Heidelberg was created off the back of that. There was some housing developed there as really the first sort of athletes' village. It's turned into a suburb in its own right now. There's obviously been some renewal in that precinct and more to happen, but I guess that's our first foray into the space. Then I think if we fast forward to Sydney 2000, the Olympic and Paralympic Games, I'm sure there's people in the audience from New South Wales and from Sydney, my colleague John, for example. Obviously, that was one of the last games that created a brand new precinct in a brand new location, everything in together, all the infrastructure out at Olympic Park, which was a pretty unused location prior to the Games. So lots of infrastructure going into the one place. We know that the Newington suburb was created, and that was the low to mid-rise housing on the right-hand side of your screen there, that is now the suburb of Newington. And then later on, post-game, sort of 5, 10, 15 years on, we're seeing more high density into that location as well. So there's lots of housing flowing through that location for a variety of different reasons, not necessarily forecasted legacy, probably just more based on immense need in New South Wales and Sydney, I would hazard a guess. But certainly that stock initially at Newington was part of the Athletes' Village, and so was the additional modular stock that was part of that housing mix that then went off to other regional locations around Queensland. Sorry, my New South Wales friends, across New South Wales. So interesting approach there in Sydney as well. So go to Gold Coast next. The 2018 Commonwealth Games. We know again another precinct created for housing for the Athletes' Village. This is now called the Smith Collective. Some of you have probably been there. For any musos in the audience, this is where the Big Day Out used to be held in Queensland before this precinct was created. This is 18 buildings and 1,252 units of accommodation created in that location. So it was a great supply response, really useful for the games, but no market housing legacy out of that precinct at all, unfortunately. It was the first build to rent that was done in Australia, my knowledge, and we probably missed some opportunities there around social and affordable housing legacy and other non-market housing opportunities. So that's an Australian context. I think when we first heard that we'd been awarded the Games in 2021, one of the first things we wanted to do as a sector is recognise that there were some opportunities here because, first of all, it was the longest runway anyone's ever had to plan for Olympic and Paralympic Games. So that presents some opportunity as well as some risks. So we took a real positive frame into the work. We did a bit of work with Urbis there in July 22, and that was looking at what the social and affordable housing and social inclusion legacy could be for hosting these games. There were 52 recommendations across 5 key areas, and one of the central recommendations was to establish a housing market monitoring system and a displacement monitoring system that you could look at every single year in the lead up to the Games. So we knew exactly what was happening in the system, and we could actually evaluate our current policy responses and tweak those or make further investments if required. So I won't spend too much time here on the next slide other than to say that that first body of work was the catalyst for what I'm talking to you about today. In that first body of work, we case studied some other games to really get some learnings from what they did well. Were they intentional about their legacy? If they were, did they have better impacts in their housing system response than those host cities that weren't intentional? In some cases that was the case. But unfortunately, there isn't a lot of best practice, as my colleague from QUT in the audience might attest, in terms of real, true housing legacy from hosting these events, really anywhere in the world. Now, that opportunity still presents for us. We've still got 7 years to go, and we're still taking a very positive frame into what could be a real challenging set of circumstances if we don't get the planning right. So just before I get into talking a little bit about what we're actually monitoring and why, I just wanted to reflect again on some past games, and it's not the most prettiest slide there, but I just want to reflect on a couple of things that are happening right now that are relevant to our planning for the Brisbane 2032 Games. First of all, Atlanta, you go back to 1996, this was where there was a very compliant sort of police emergency response to homelessness in that location. There were lots of police citations. They were even treating homelessness as a criminal activity in some parts in that time. And so that response was seen as incredibly unkind and obviously created lots of trauma and other ripple effects through the system after those games. It's telling that I think the lens is similar again in planning for LA, and if you're following any of the press over in the US, you'll see that some of these measures are being considered again. Like there's some really worrying language in the US in terms of how they're looking at responding to homelessness, not just in Los Angeles, but right across the country. And I guess what we're trying to say here is we don't want to end up in a situation like that. There's many things we can do in the 7 years that we've got to avoid some of those responses that I hope aren't even in the frame as we get to 2032. The other one I wanted to reflect on here was Brisbane's urban renewal. Even though it's not an Olympic or Paralympic Games, we did have World Expo in 1988. And Brisbane went through a lot of gentrification and change in that period, and that did have lots of impacts on some of the more fragile parts of the housing system, particularly boarding houses, low-cost accommodation, all these aspects of the housing system where land values were actually seen as higher for other purposes through that change period. And so people living in those settings weren't necessarily mapped through to alternative housing settings, and there was lots of displacement that occurred. Some amazing new precincts and spaces created, and that's what most of the reporting is on in that period of time, but less so on the displacement that actually occurred. And one of the things that we've learned through this exercise so far, and I'll just, how am I going, John? Still got a bit of time? Yeah, great. Fantastic. So I want to just sort of hone in on that whilst there are lots of impacts that major events, known major events, have on existing housing systems that are probably already struggling through their normal cycle, it disproportionately impacts people that are on low incomes, obviously, people who are already homeless or in vulnerable settings, and people that are marginally housed. So that's a big part of what we're monitoring, but we're also monitoring the other systems' impacts across the entire housing system. Now, one of the things I wanted to reflect on, and some people in the audience have travelled recently abroad to Paris, for example, where there was a mass relocation program of people that were living, sleeping rough in Paris to regional campsites and regional locations, probably about 18 months up to that Games. And we've heard this in other host cities as well. With this report, we're really comparing ourselves to developing nations. Obviously, some other host cities have been have different economies and have approached things in an even more aggressive way, but we are comparing and benchmarking ourselves to other developing economies and or developed economies. And so looking at Paris and now looking at LA, we are concerned about what we're hearing about the approaches to people that are rough sleeping and the set of policies that are being chosen to deal with that set of issues. And that's why I keep reflecting on the time frame that we've got. There's still lots of things we can do in the 7 years that we've got. But we need to be understanding what's happening in the housing market every single year to be able to make really good policy choices and investments. So in terms of our games, prior to our recent state election, which was in October last year, there was a big body of work done on what the legacy could be for the games, looking at a whole bunch of different sort of key result areas across sport, community, multiculturalism, disability, a whole bunch of different areas. We, of course, made the case for a housing legacy. We think it's a great opportunity to really link housing to the games and go, well, what can we do positively to really harness this opportunity and deliver a great housing legacy? We found early on we're actually trying to link housing to the games. I think there was a very intentional kind of approach to de-link those aspects and say that housing's a BAU response from government, it's not really a games-related activity. I think that attitude is shifting. And there's, you can see there as evidence of the existing legacy plan right now, which is probably subject to change under the new government, that there was some moves to look at things like the athletes' village accommodation and go, well, what sort of legacy can we get out of this stock for social and affordable housing? I will just pause there and say that for us, we see that as 101, a bare minimum. What legacy we get out of the athletes' accommodation should be like the fundamental thing, and then everything else is on top of that. For us, it's about a housing legacy across the entire housing system. That's what we're really looking to catalyse in Queensland. So I've still got a few minutes, don't I? Yeah. So in terms of what we're monitoring, a little bit like you, Humair, too, I'm struggling without my glasses as well. I would just say this is oh yeah, thanks, John. This is probably the most complete single view, as my colleagues from Ahuri might be able to attest, of any games looking at this as a single picture. So what we're trying to do is not just monitor supply, we're also looking at rental affordability, we're looking at mortgage affordability, we're looking at the short-term accommodation space and how that changes annually in the lead up to the games. We're looking at the spatial distribution of incomes and different household types. And we're also looking at the crisis accommodation system and how that changes. And we're particularly trying to look at things like CRA and other subsidies and where different household incomes are moving based on prices in different locations and how they might be pushed out to the fringes and into the regions that might not be appropriately resourced to assist them unless we get the planning right. Of course, we're looking at our homelessness data and response and how that's changing over time. We are also looking at the non-market housing space and looking at how that maps through this target location. And I should say that this report is squarely focused on South East Queensland, so that's the 12 local government areas in South East Queensland, and the impact's been seen in these different result areas annually at the LGA level over that time. Now, the other reason to do this work, and I'll tell you where you can find the report. We're about to release the 2025 edition in the next couple of weeks. But the reason to do this report is not just to say, there's a little bit of so what to it. So you're monitoring housing markets, prices are going up, there's a lack of supply, all the things that we see in every other report. This report's really about, so what, is there an impact by the games that's above and beyond the normal market cycle? And we think that we can prove in some cases that there is. And if there is, what are we actually going to do about it? So that's the so what element for this report. And so here's an example of some of the proactive sort of policy responses we're looking at and engaging with government on. And we'll look to recalibrate those when the 2025 report comes out. But it's an intentional report for us to understand what games-related activity does in different locations above and beyond normal housing market pressures and the impact that has on low to moderate income households primarily. In closing, I just want to thank our partners from Ahuri, who's been a wonderful partner to work with on this body of work, and this is something that we'll be doing every year right up to 2032 and probably for the next couple of years after to really understand the resulting impacts of hosting such a significant event. Thank you.
Again, a great session. Thanks very much, Jackson. Please keep those questions in mind. I'll certainly be asking these guys a few questions of each other, and also I encourage you to do that. These are great opportunities for learnings. So now, of course, we get to the unknown unknowns when it comes to preparing and displacement and homelessness. So I'm really pleased to welcome Elly to the rostrum. She, of course, works for Resilient Lismore, and really keen to hear from her about what they've done when you don't know what's going to happen. Thanks, Elly.
Good morning, folks. Thanks so much for choosing us over a number of the other presentations, and a real honour to be here speaking to you today. I join many other people in this conference in acknowledging our First Nations custodians across the country, and in doing that I always acknowledge leaders in my community. So in my community, immediately after the significant disaster of 2022, the Koori Mail, which is a 100% Aboriginal-owned media outlet, led the initial disaster recovery response in my home community, helping thousands of people meet their immediate needs. And so if you don't know that story, I encourage you to look it up and see what First Nations leadership in action looks like. So this is the bit where I always get a little bit emotional. Here's a photo that I took in my hometown of Lismore as I drove over the hill to try to get myself to some Wi-Fi so that I could coordinate and communicate with my community as we face significant disruption after the disaster of 2022. In that photo, you can see approximately 17 homes of the 14,500 or so that were damaged in that region-wide disaster. In my community of Lismore, and that's the CBD that you can look down onto there, that equated to around about 1,700 residential properties in quite a small area. So this image that you're looking at is the SES damage impact report from a couple of days into the event. So the red dots are severely or catastrophically damaged housing, orange severe, yellow moderate, slight. So that is a massive impact in the heart of our community. And that is just Lismore. That doesn't represent the downstream communities of Corrokai, Wardell, Woodburn, Broadwater, the hills, the communities up in the hills where houses slid down in landslides in Nimbin across Mullumbimby, up into Byron, into Murwillumbah, and numerous people living in caravan parks through Chindra in the Tweed. Huge impact. The police estimate that at the height of this disaster there are around 15,000 people in evacuation centres across the region, and if you think that many people go to families and friends, not just to evacuation centres, I would broadly anticipate or estimate that we probably saw a displacement at the height of that event of 20 to 25,000 people from their homes. Nearly 4 years on, we are still living with the impacts of that event. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about what the housing response has been in our community. So we are dealing with now the largest adaptation program that has ever been seen in Australia, the majority of which is being delivered in my home community of Lismore. So there have been a variety of government responses, and we'll talk a little bit about pod villages, which Humair is very familiar with. So we'll go to pod villages. So thinking about that disruption, so when you think about the housing that was impacted in Lismore in particular, don't quote me, but I heard it was around about 30% private rental stock in our city. So primarily tenants became displaced really rapidly. I heard stories of people being put into emergency accommodation as far away as Emerald in Queensland. We had people in hotels and motels up in the Gold Coast, all the way down the east coast of New South Wales, and one of the government responses was to build pod villages. So those pod villages estimated at around $350 million of cost to build around 11 pod villages across the region. It took quite a while for those to get in place, maybe 8, 9, up to 12 months for those to be built. At the time it was proposed that they would be about 2 years. Many of them are still in existence, one being decommissioned now, and the good folks at Homes New South Wales are working to try to transition a number of those tenants into permanent or social housing, which is very, very challenging in a region where there was already a significant housing crisis. In the latest strategies from disaster resilience and recovery folks, it's documented that pod villages are not a preferred response. In subsequent disasters, there's been a focus on a caravans at home program. So there's documentation that if you displace people from their home for a long period of time, their mental health and wellbeing outcomes are greatly lessened. So there's a real focus to try to keep people on their properties. So pod villages. Then we move to the Resilient Homes program. So currently in Northern Rivers of New South Wales, we're living with the rollout of the Resilient Homes program. On that slide, you can see around 80 of the 900 homes that have been offered for buybacks across our region. In Lismore, if you remember, I said 1,700 residential properties impacted. In Lismore, we think it's going to be around about 500 to 600 of those homes. Those buybacks will be in my community. It's been a voluntary process, which means that we've got kind of perverse outcomes in a lot of our community. We've got checkerboarding, where some people have taken buybacks and some people haven't. Because it takes a significant amount of time to manage that many empty homes, we've had a lot of social unrest about homes sitting empty while people are homeless. We've had squatters. You've probably seen some of the media, particularly if you're in New South Wales. We do have people living in abandoned homes, and again, we just don't have enough housing stock to meet the immediate needs of the people in our community who are desperate for housing. There is also a home raise and retrofit program that's being delivered as part of that. We're involved in trying to support some folks through those home raises, and the home retrofits are really about flooding. I mean, there's an interesting intersection there about climate resilience beyond just the impacts of flooding. And, you know, are we actually meeting the opportunity that we have through this significant program to strengthen and improve the outcomes and the wellbeing outcomes of people in our community? At the bottom there, I'll just note that off the Reconstruction Authority website, we're looking at probably about 220 relocations of homes. The majority of those are being delivered by the people who either owned the home in the first instance, who have subsequently purchased them in auction processes, and the Reconstruction Authority, no shade on the Reconstruction Authority, they're delivering a really, really huge and complicated project, have moved 4. So I feel like there is this real opportunity and there's this real determination in our community to try to see some of that housing stock repurposed for the needs of people who have housing insecurity in our region. But I think what we're going to see is about 50% of that housing stock demolished, and the remainder moved through a combination of private and government effort, but primarily private. And this is all being really pushed hard at the moment. There is a end date of trying to get all of this work done by mid-2027. It's pretty big. It's really complicated. And we don't know what the future looks like beyond that. So I just want to go to some of the work that Resilient Lismore has been doing. So in our immediate response to the floods, we looked around our community and we said, we have housing for these thousands of people who are displaced. It's just damaged. We have people attempting to live in that housing. We just need to make sure that that housing is safe, secure and warm. And from that basic premises, we started making sure that the windows closed, making sure that the doors locked, and putting up 2 rooms of walls in houses that had been completely internally demolished. There was this real mania that swept through our community that meant that every single house that had been flooded had to have the entire contents of the inside ripped out. I saw so many unnecessary bathroom demolitions. It was really quite an incredible thing. And speaking to asbestos, which was raised earlier this morning, mountains and piles of asbestos on the streets. We were actually kind of lucky that a month after the first flood, we had the 4th largest flood we had ever seen on record. That 4th largest flood came through and washed all the asbestos out to sea. So, silver linings, I suppose, for trying to manage the health outcomes of a disaster of that significant scale. So we were privately funded to the tune of $3 to $4 million. We managed to secure a $5 million investment from the incoming Minns Labor government that we have used to work on more than 750 owner-occupied homes in our region to try to make those homes safe, secure, warm and livable. The concern that I have for my community is that we now have fragile people living in fragile homes. There's been a lot of conversation at this conference that I've heard about building new housing and building housing complexes in cities. My concern is for regional communities that are living in homes that are becoming unfit for purpose, uninsurable, fragile and not climate resilient or climate ready. We have an ageing population, we have people with higher proportions of disability, disability, mental health and wellness concerns, and those folks are living in houses that are not going to see them live safely as we experience compounding, increasing frequent disasters of scale like the ones that we have lived through. Bottom right-hand corner there, you can see some of the homes in Terania Street that are being demolished. So just touching on the Resilient Lands program as well. So this is a government program of about $100 million. If you start doing the sums in your head, you can see we've had around about $1 billion investment so far into the Northern Rivers from this variety of different programs. So we have 4 that I've listed there. Mount Pleasant in Engeler with the 4 homes that the Reconstruction Authority have relocated. We have East Lismore coming online with 400 lots, 20% affordable, which is a great outcome. We don't know the timeline for delivery for that development. North Lismore, 85 lots, timeline unclear, and Landcom are working in partnership with Lismore City Council to deliver some social affordable housing across the city as well. But you can see what I'm trying to point out is we have an immediate, a medium-term and a long-term response, and I think what we have seen and what we are living through in Lismore in particular is that those different responses are not intersecting to meet the needs of the people in our community, particularly the people who are living with a risk of homelessness. So the last photo I'll show you there is a photo that was taken this year. This is of a family who is living, they have tenancy rights, until they're evicted in one of the empty homes in North Lismore. These folks have nowhere to go. They are trying to negotiate with Homes New South Wales, with Social Futures, with the social housing providers for somewhere for them to live with safety and security, but that is not forthcoming anytime soon. So I really think that as we move into a climate disrupted society, and let's not talk about the National Climate Disaster Risk report that came out recently that shows that East Coast communities will be living with 1.5 million homes under threat of sea level rise. We have to start thinking strategically about putting housing in places where people won't be at risk, but we need to do that in a staggered way. That's our story in a very fast snapshot. I look forward to the conversation. You can find me and continue the conversation if you would like to.
Thank you very much. And again, just please join me in thanking Elly for that fantastic presentation. If for no other reason, it's a nice segue into the questions that we'll ask, because it's clear it's a personal, subjective thing. This is not something academic or out there and objective. This is something that you yourself experienced, which was a nice way to talk about some questions. So just very quickly, and the great thing about these Ahuri sessions is we've not practiced these questions. These are not been practiced. I'm just going to have a go at leaning in and hearing what I heard, hearing what each might have learnt from each other, because I've certainly learnt lots already today. And again, really leaning on you in the audience here to ask the question, be brave. We all appreciate these opportunities to learn something, so I'll make sure that each of you here today comes away learning something from the Uhuru conference that you certainly didn't know before you came. So that's my quest. So I might start with you, Elly. We at Shelter New South Wales had a great piece of advice at the time, which was, as much as you might be tempted to all jump into a white van and all drive up to Lismore and help, if you don't already have a relationship with an organisation in Lismore, please stay away. And it was a really nice piece of sage advice. So with that in mind, is there something that you could reflect on about how people really want to help, but it's a bit like those clothing bins that have piles of clothes, or people who just leave things, or I get calls every day for come and pick up a mattress that's 20 years old, and I have to be really diplomatic and say to people, I know you want to help, but the best thing you could do is something else. Any ideas about how people can help in a really productive way and not be offended in the process if we don't give them the answer they want?
Thank you. That's a really important learning piece for us to embrace as a nation, and really stuff is just not needed at the immediate time of crisis. So culturally across our entire country, we need to learn that if you want to donate, you should donate cash to trusted sources. give it a fantastic organisation, but also to find local organisations that are delivering on the ground. So we were very fortunate, again, another silver lining of being at the epicentre of such a significant disaster, and we had learnt. So we responded in 2017. Our learning in 2017 was that we, as a community-based organisation, had about 2 weeks to respond to capture the attention of the country. We did that. We launched our own fundraising campaign. We raised enough money to be able to set us up to still be here today, 4 years on. So yeah, money, trusted organisations, and to keep showing up for the long haul as well. I'll just frame that in terms of the housing response as well. I cannot count the number of people who contacted me offering modular temporary housing solutions. Very complicated space to work in, but those offers just sort of disappear. But we've got to remember with disasters the very long tail of recovery, and there are opportunities to plan for significant partnerships that can meet the need of communities.
That's excellent. Thank you. Jackson, similarly, and just reflecting on that idea of some learnings or reflections, something that you've learned or that you're learning, I know it's a continuing process, but either from Sydney or previous examples that you've used around Olympics, and that really to learn that we need not make that same mistake again, or how you might make sure that you're really listening to people around the Olympics and what we're looking for housing.
Yeah. Well, I said in my presentation that unfortunately there is an unbelievable best practice in responding to this, but one thing that we have learned through the work that we've already done with both Urbis and now the early stages of studying recent games has been where the legacy capture or the legacy plans have been intentional about something to do with housing or something to do with housing legacy, even if it is just the Athletes Village, but if it's more than that, those games have probably mitigated some of the risks a bit better than others. So it's a tough space because there's not a lot of success in it, to be quite honest, but that doesn't mean that we can't set the best trajectory ever in Brisbane in 2032, by the way, with a housing legacy. But that's been one thing that we've noted. So the intentionality of some sort of housing legacy, particularly for low to moderate income households, but just generally in the legacy planning.
Thank you. Humair, I know that Waterloo is the example that you've used, but I know your role is broader than that. It's engagement across the whole of the state. What's a lesson or something that you might say, I really want the people here to take away this one idea based on your reflections or learnings in that role of engagement, and what makes a difference?
Yeah, I think trust is a main, special ingredient in all of this, and that cannot be built overnight. So if you are embedded in local communities, you work with them over a long period of time. So you need that whole infrastructure at an organizational level to be able to do that at scale, especially for an organization that has properties across the state. So that's what we're trying to build in-house, inside homes, rebuild, like we used to have that, and then of course, various changes happened. So one of the focuses is we've brought the whole tenant participation function in-house. It used to be outsourced before. We have community development functions sort of being created at the same time. So I think the secret is that you have to be in with the communities for the long haul. Organizations like yours, Elly, I mean, you couldn't have just just stood up and started, hit the ground running just at the point of the disaster. You have to be there in the community. The community needs to trust you. And, I mean, it is hard. I mean, the kind of work state housing agencies do is difficult. It's often thankless. We don't have enough money to provide all the support needed to tenants. So, building that trust is hard. Like, people do have, not very good experiences with the service provided by us. But the more you engage, the more you're there and you show up, and you listen, I think that's the secret ingredient.
When we talk about risk, we think about risk being a static thing of impact and likelihood. The Swiss cheese idea says, well, what happens when two bad things happen at the one time? How do you prepare for that? We were just, as we came on stage earlier, we're thinking about, have we really learnt the lessons from, say, COVID? So I'm interested to hear, as much as we don't want COVID to happen again, we certainly learnt some things. And I'm interested to hear what would happen if, I hope this doesn't, but something like a flood and a COVID episode happened at the same time, or what would happen in the case of the Olympics if all goes to plan and they're not, like they did in Tokyo, they had to put it off, or similarly, anything that you're doing at the moment. So have we thought about two awful things happening at the one time, and what's some ideas you've got about how we can prepare for, the Swiss cheese idea? I might start with you, Elly.
Well, it did happen at the same time. So 2022 was on the tail end of COVID. So we definitely had COVID washing around the evacuation centres. We had COVID through the emergency service camps, through the RFS, through the ADF, the Defence Force, the Army folks who came into town. I mean, I sometimes say the definition of a disaster is when everything stops working. It's one of the ways I try to encourage my community to go a little bit easily on government agencies because everything stops working. So, look, I don't know what our solutions need to be other than to plan for every opportunity. And I think Lismore and the Northern Rivers, we are really, I've been talking about us lately like we're a canary in a coal mine, right? So we are the opportunity to remind everyone in the country of how bad things can get, and we do need to be planning for and thinking about worst case scenarios.
Yeah, great answer, by the way, Elly. I think there's probably two things I'd say about that in the context of what I presented, John. So first of all, the expense, if that were to happen, would be enormous. And in the case of Tokyo, the delay went from a $7 billion spend on the Olympics to $15 billion from what I've read. So that's an enormous expense that we all bear. So that's the first thing. I guess the other thing that I'd be encouraging us to think about, and we've been talking about this before we started today, was how do we meld the two responses together a little bit more? So we've been talking the last couple of days about the crisis we currently have, but we don't necessarily deploy the sort of crisis responses that we do when we have the weather-based events. And I mean, I know myself, I've been to 4 different forums and functions and events that have been talking about this very issue, about trying to bring those two responses together. When we have the weather events, we've got special powers and we can override some planning schemes and we can really get in there and kind of move a bit quicker. But the urgency is still there, particularly where I'm from in Queensland at the moment, in many locations to respond to the homelessness crisis. So how can we, from a policy perspective, weave those two things together to deal with the Swiss cheese example? That's probably a provocation.
Humair.
I think especially disasters or, the perfect storm of when 2 or 3 things happen at the same time. Of course, planning is important. And you're right, Jackson, there's sometimes opportunities in there as well that you need to grasp at the time. But I think what happens internationally, and I think as a country, we have a lot of trust in institutions, which really helps. And people do look towards their governments when disasters happen, right? And the government agencies have to mobilize quickly and provide that support. And we've seen time and again that they do step up. I think compared to, say, many other countries where, the institutions are weaker and not properly funded, the response is quite different. Luckily, we are firstly a compliant country. Look at our compliance during COVID, and we have trust in institutions, and that's really important, I think. For any disaster, any perfect storm of 2 or 3 things happening, this whole thing, our belief in our institutions and actually people working with government is really important. And we see that. I mean, we work very closely with our NGO partners. Like, actually, the business of my branch is entirely, almost 80% focused outward, working with specialist homelessness services, community housing providers. We have other parts of the business that work with directly with services like yours, Elly, and community development and all of that. So I think that coming together of the whole civil society is really important in the face of disasters, yeah.
Excellent. When you talk about government, we often say government, there's 3 levels of government, we all agree, and Humair and I have laughed about this once before. Like a lot of people in Australia, we think we could do without one of them, we just can't agree which level it is. Local government, I've heard all 3 of you mention. So Elly, you talked about Lismore, Jackson talked about the 12 in the southeast, and I know that in the case of the City of Sydney, very supportive around Waterloo. So yeah, just any reflections on, we've got over 520 local governments in the country. Any reflection, and they run the full gamut of, some are very engaged in homelessness services specifically, some should be but aren't. So again, any reflections about how that particular level of government has done something unique, different, or has really helped in a way which, to be honest, other governments, local governments in particular, could learn from in terms of leaning in? I might start with you.
I might throw to the others, actually.
Yeah. So Humair or Jackson, local government.
Yeah, I'll go quickly. Yeah, sure. I mean, look, John, in the example that I was presenting, I think we've had a lot of engagement with the SEQ councils, and in Queensland we have really big councils. So Brisbane's the biggest council in the Southern Hemisphere, for example, followed by Gold Coast, followed by Moreton Bay, I'm pretty sure. So 3 of those are in that SEQ band. So they're really big councils, and I think historically, as we all know in this room, that historically, some of the issues that we're passionate about, local government haven't seen themselves directly responsible for, and nor have they been funded for it, by the way. They get a very small percentage of the tax pie as well to be able to spread their resources. But what I've been impressed with in Queensland is how that they've started to find a way to lean into parts of the response that still fit neatly with their community kind of response. So, you know, managing rough sleeping in public space and working with the NGO sector and state government through a coordinated response. So I guess what we're doing with our report is making sure that local government is very in tune to what's happening in their location. They can't deal with the problem across the whole state, but in their location they can play a really key part. And so there's a whole bunch of planning responses that they can be a part of, but also in engaging in the responding to crisis accommodation need and also community engagement to make sure that they're the closest level of government to the community, obviously. So and they're the most trusted form of government, by the way, in every report I've read as well. So leveraging that to make sure that communities understand the pressures that we're under and why certain policy choices have been chosen and helping articulate that. That's how we're working with local government in this context.
Humair, again, you touched on the City of Sydney, for example.
Yeah, so I think that's a key relationship. And look, I mean, if not moving away from disasters rightly and disruption because of that, the work we've done with councils in New South Wales over the delivery of affordable housing, it's a long and enduring relationship with many councils. And I will call out City of Sydney because they are the front, the torchbearers in terms of throwing everything, all planning instruments, using all planning instruments, concessional land sales, grants, contribution schemes, planning agreements, you name it, they've done it to create affordable housing. Other councils are following suit. I think there's such a big need now that all levels of government are kind of like coalescing to create more affordable housing generally. But in this context, the topic of today, which is around disasters, I think their role is critical. Like, I mean, they are a major partner in delivery of services on the ground. So we would definitely rely on them. Obviously, they are not resourced for that kind of like intensive support, but their role is critical in terms of the community part of thing, and they are closest to the community. We rely on them a lot, yeah.
I will just throw in there, so one of the reasons I kind of bounced it to the other panellists is, I'm from a regional area in New South Wales. I was an elected councillor for 8 years for my sins. The council environment in our regional context is incredibly challenging. We have local governments have no resources to be able to lean into this space in a significant way. One of the examples that I gave at the end there, which is the council-led project, I think it's going to deliver 16 units in Engeler, and that started when I started my tenure on council, so 9 years ago. So no agency really to deliver anything meaningful, definitely interest, but no capacity. Different to metropolitan councils, which I think have a lot more resourcing that they can leverage and a lot more levers they can pull. And with the regional context, local governments need additional support to be able to lead in this space because they are under immense pressure.
Just before I flick to our audience here to ask some questions, just one, again, in that idea of leaving here with something memorable, some takeaway. I know that we've talked about what's good. What wouldn't you do? Just a very quick example of from your learnings in your respective areas. So renewal, Olympics coming up, and an emergency. What's a nice sage piece of advice you can say? And it doesn't have to be a wise one. It could be something that we tried to do this, it just didn't work. Don't do that. Trap for new players. Here's a warning, spoiler alert. Don't do that if you're trying to achieve X, Y, Z. I'm happy to anyone to start off.
That's a tough one.
You go first if you're ready to go.
Look, I think there's a whole bank of learnings, I think, that we have over things that have gone wrong that were totally out of our control, and there are things that we could definitely have done better. So I can only speak from my experience. Yes, I think when, and going back to the topic I was sort of presenting on, yes, if you don't do proper engagement, you can have a huge backlash. And not just backlash from the community you are kind of, helping, but also the broader community. So whenever we are doing this level of, or this scale of renewal, there's not the affected community, but the broader community, getting buy-in from them and making sure that that kind of process goes smoothly is really important. So how you engage not just the affected community, but the broader community is important. So what not to do is not to ignore the other broader stakeholders in this space. Yeah.
Excellent. Jackson or Elly?
Yeah, thought about it. It's a great question, John. I mean, the project we're doing is still pretty much in its infancy, right? So I'm sure we'll learn a lot more. But I think allyship, we heard it this morning in a previous presentation, like that the allyship around this set of issues across other parts of the system is really important. Even in this report, we've got 5 partners, but they're all in our sector. And Humair is an incredibly reputable partner, but what I probably would have done differently and still have the chance to do, but just might have been more beneficial right now, is if we had our colleagues that are over at the conference across the road, for example, on board with the need for this as well. And that's the property council, property industry, and other parts of the housing system. I think if we presented even more allyship across the housing system for having this focus on the housing legacy and why it's important. Right now, with where we're at, I think we could have been a slightly further along in the plan, and I still think we have that opportunity in front of us. That's what I would have done differently.
This is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but don't have a major disaster on the eve of a federal election when you're about to have a complete change of government with a new bureaucracy that then gets wound down and then wound up an even bigger and newer democracy, and then a change of government at the state level. Don't do that, because it's been an absolute nightmare. And I guess the other challenging thing in the disaster context is, don't rush things. And probably with that context that I just spoke about, disasters are intensely political. They are intensely political, especially when you think about the time of ours. We came off the back of the bushfires when, ScoMo wouldn't hold a hose. You politicians want to come in and they want to give big, rapid solutions and tell the community that they're here to fix everything. And so then we see policy and program responses that have been too fast. So when Humair talks about trust, and I see the slide about supporting people with accommodation and with services and all of the wraparound supports that are being provided, that is not there in my community as we move through a really fast and disruptive program. So it's a tension that we have to manage, and it's a political tension to not rush these big programs. We've had $1 billion, more than $1 billion invested into our community, and I don't yet see positive outcomes that I can really hang my hat on and go, that is a great outcome for my community that has happened as a result of that massive amount of investment. Yet, I'm eternally hopeful and optimistic.
Excellent. Okay, that's a nice segue to be able to flip to you, the audience. So if you'd raise your hand, and then one of the great Ahuri volunteers in the red T-shirt will come over to you. I'll nominate you. I can see you. They may not be able to. So just raise your hands, and I think I can see Jesse Taylor down here, the gentleman with his hand up in the blue suit. And please say where you're from and whether or not you want a particular panel member to answer the question, or you're happy for anyone on the panel to have it.
That's great. Thanks. Well, thanks, John. Wow, my voice comes back really loud. Sorry about that. So I'm Jesse Taylor. I'm with Mission Australia Housing. I applaud the panel and what you guys have put together. It's a really important conversation. I'm working on a comparable project here, Elly, in the Taree area, which has also been multiply impacted by floods, bushfires, heat waves, COVID. And we're working in collaboration across an MOU with 2 other community housing providers, Home in Place and CHL, and we're working across heaps of stakeholders. And while we're doing that, the tenants that we're engaged with bring a healthy dose of skepticism in respect to authorities coming in and saying, we're going to solve your problems, because it just doesn't work. And so we are co-designing and co-sharing like a power structure moving forward so that they're prepared and preparing their communities. It's based on an evidence model. And I see Elly doing a bit of that up in Lismore as well, and that's great. And I think maybe, Humair, this one kind of comes in your direction, just in that I think a lot of people living in community housing and social housing You know, they don't want to rely on institutions, and so it becomes a question of like, how can we like large organizations, like Homes New South Wales and New South Wales government, share the approach, to resolving the impacts of climate-related disasters in communities, and how do we scale that up?
Yeah, that's a good and very topical question. I mean, we are looking at how we can make our houses more resilient to climate, how better to respond in emergencies, how we can save people on their power bills. I mean, this is such a multi-layered topic on climate adaptation and climate resilience. Affects just like other parts of the housing system, the subsidized housing system. I think even more so because our tenants are more vulnerable. So, yeah, and I think there's a cost involved in kind of building more climate resilient houses. Adapting existing houses to become more resilient is obviously a cost. I mean, we have more levers when we're building new stuff. I mean, the sustainability is a big focus nowadays when we are building new stuff, but I think a lot of our aging stock definitely is, there is a massive cost involved in actually making them better, both comfortable in these extreme weather events and extreme climates that we are facing, and also more resilient when there is a disaster. So I don't think I have the answer to that, but I think what we do is that we work with the peak body, GA New South Wales. We have done a project on how to sort of, and it was a really amazing project. I would encourage anybody to go on the website and have a look at that project. I think the report has been published. I'm not sure whether Mark or someone else is in the room, but I can send that information later on. And we are working. So we internally are doing a fair bit of work on that. We are supporting the sector do that work. But yes, I think the elephant in the room is the cost of adapting to that, and that is going to be a challenge going forward. But I think it's something that we need to take on, because I know a lot of community housing provider boards are struggling with that, because it's a board responsibility as well, right? To sort of environment is like a big thing in a lot of those discussions. So I think it's top of everybody's mind. I'm not sure whether I answered your question, but.
Providers are working with tenants, in this co-design space. We really want like Homes New South Wales to come along on a journey with us. So there's this consistent approach straight across the board. And so maybe it is, working with GA New South Wales and ACH and everybody else as we move forward, just the capacity build and support, and use models like what Elly's doing up in Lismore, so that people are more prepared and responsive and kind of lead on the ground when we're not there.
Yeah, actually, there's a lot of learning in the community development space as well, because I think some CHPs are doing amazing work in their local communities. So I think we need to have that cross-fertilization of ideas, definitely. Yeah.
I'll just chime in there. I think the elements of trust and local organisations that can build relationships with communities are so critically important. I mean, Humair was talking about trust in institutions. In my experience, trust in institutions is declining, but organisations like ours are intermediaries in terms of providing a trusted bridge between government and community. So community doesn't necessarily always have to be dealing with, Janelle Saffin called it the other day, the dead hand of bureaucracy, which was completely apt at times. But yeah, so I think we need to really lean into building trusted intermediaries in communities who can play multiple roles of support for exactly the folks you're talking about.
Excellent. So I can see some more hands up. So yeah, just if one of the red over here, there's a gentleman 3 rows down on just behind you. Sorry, that gentleman there behind you. That's it. Put your hand up. Thanks. And just identify where you're from and who you'd like on the panel to ask the question primarily.
Sorry, I think I queue-jumped the 2 guys in front of me, but I'll take the opportunity. My name's Travis Maguire from Engeler, Southern Queensland. So my question's more for Jackson, just for the upcoming Olympics. Brisbane City Council and Moreton Bay Council haven't probably reacted the best recently to some of the homelessness in public spaces, and copped a fair bit of flack over that. in Toowoomba we see the flow-on effect from that, where those displaced people from those cities then move an hour away to a regional town where we've got our own set of circumstances, obviously. Just wondering if that's been part of the conversation for the upcoming Olympics, just for that flow-on effect to rural communities that are already struggling, possibly taking on more of the work from the city's response.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I mean, there's just two quick things I'd say. The report is looking at that from a data perspective. So we are looking at, for example, I mentioned earlier, we're tracking CRA subsidies and then looking at how that's showing up in different housing types. And we're already seeing some movement out of some areas into what are sort of lower socio-economic parts of SEQ from a price point of view, but from other policy perspectives as well. So there's been, but I think more to your point, we've also convened through our Minister O'Connor, who you'd know in Queensland, a Homelessness Ministerial Advisory Council. And one of the subgroups of that is also around the SEQ councils. So we've got the 12 mayors around the table in South East Queensland with the Minister and bringing the other state agencies to that table as well. So we've got police, corrections, but also health and community services and housing at the table too, at the Director General level. And the point of that is to look at exactly what you're saying. There's been some changes from a local government policy perspective in one of those locations. In another case, they're just enacting the policy that they've already had. But whichever way you look at it, we are seeing some of that movement from based on those policy, what we might call punitive policy measures, showing up in other parts of the region. So our case has been, well, we've got to deal with this as a region. Whichever way we look at it, we've got to deal with this as an overarching region. And we don't favour, as you know, the compliance-based approach. I think that's not even really, in my view, a last resort. And we're trying to find a way to bring those councils to a rising tide to a better response. We have some councils in SEQ that are delivering a very compassionate and coordinated response. So by bringing them all together around the table, we feel like we'll be able to convince some of those other councils down that path. So it's a great, timely question. There's a lot of activity happening in that space.
Again, just put your hands up nice and high. Sorry, so someone down the front here. I think it's UQ, is that right?
The other way.
Yeah. Hi, Lyndall.
Hi,
Thanks.
Lyndall Bryant from QUT, the other university in Brisbane. So thank you so much, each of you, for your presentations and your work in this space. It's just amazing the work that's going on there, and looking forward to working with Jackson and QShelter on building a Brisbane Olympic housing legacy plan. It's one of my pet topics as well. I've got so many things going around in my head from your presentations. I'm not quite sure where this question's going to land, but I'm going to go to Elly. And you talked about how you've got a 2-week window after a disaster to, capture, before that news cycle moves on. So here we are, 4 years after Lismore, and then you have the Taree example, which I think was this year. You've got Western Queensland, which all went underwater and really didn't get a lot of media attention. How do you keep the focus and the attention of all the stakeholders when that news cycle is so short, when it's a long-term recovery solution?
Yeah, it's very difficult. Like when I was invited to be a part of this conversation, even in the first conversation that we had, it was like, well, let's talk about the time of disruption and the displacement and what happened in the immediacy. And I said, well, I actually want to talk about what's happening in my community now. Like, I actually want to talk about the impact that is occurring now, 4 years on. And I would suggest that most of you in the audience had no idea, really, that was happening in my community, and that we're seeing close to 50% of homes taken out of our flood zone and what that might mean for us. So I don't know. It's very, very difficult, particularly as we get more disruptions, more disasters more frequently. The media just want to focus on, the people getting rescued from their homes, or the people still living in tents 3 years after the event, right? It's a long and protracted story, and it's very challenging. So I don't know how we continue to escalate it. I think what we do need is political awareness at all levels of the long tail and the long planning that we have to do. Like, I don't know if other people in the room were as scared by the National Climate Risk Report as I was. That is an incredibly scary piece of data that is coming down the line at us, and I feel like it just vanished. It was like a week of media about it. I was like, hang on, 1.5 million I don't know if it was properties or people across the East Coast. In Ballina, down the road from me, they're going to be flooding for 200 days out of the 356 of the year. That is a massive planning problem that we have coming down the line at us. And so all of us need to be thinking with that long-term lens on what is going to be happening collectively in our communities as climate change is upon us. So I don't know. Try not to become too numb.
I've got two gentlemen here, John Swain, I think, from the City of Sydney, I think.
Hi, everyone. Elly, I'm John Swain, Manager of Homelessness at the City of Sydney. Elly, bang on about that National Climate Risk Assessment. That is terrifying. And I think, for me, for this conference, and I think your presentation as well, I know we talk about the unknowns, the knowns, and I love that sort of categorisation. I'd say climate is a known, and I said the unknown is just the risk. And I think from an Ahuri point of view, I'd love climate to be front and centre at the next housing conference, because I think it's the train that's hurtling down and it's going to impact everyone. And I think, and like I just came back from the US where I was in California, the LA wildfires, they lost 20,000 homes, they had massive impacts on the community. We're seeing it again and again. And I think I'm from Wauchope originally. That town had flooding. I think the regional voice is under a lot of pressure as well. We're seeing huge numbers of homelessness. There's places in, I think, around Victoria where they're reporting about 1,600 people rough sleeping. And so I guess my question to the panel is, we're seeing increased numbers of rough sleeping, homelessness, but also greater displacement. And part of the pattern that you see, and John, you brought up COVID, we couldn't replicate that again because we had all these empty hotels where we could place people in it. Whereas now I think we've got a critical shortage. If we had a disaster, I wouldn't be confident that I could house 360 people in the City of Sydney tomorrow, because we're missing a gap there. And I guess my question is, have we adequately planned, knowing that all these different disruptions are going to be coming up? If that answers the question, I think, have we looked at places like Byron where there's 350 people sleeping rough to go, if there was a disaster or disruption, where would they go tomorrow?
No, we haven't. And I sometimes feel like it's because it is such a massive and wicked and complicated problem that requires all of our attention and effort put onto it. But we have business as usual. We have current, urgent. You know, I often talk about the quadrant of where you need to put your attention, and we're so busy hanging out in a quadrant of urgent and important that we don't spend enough time on not urgent but critically important. And so how do we reprioritise our efforts to be trying to adequately plan for, you know, in the disaster context, how do we shift some of the investment from the immediate recovery into the planning space? The other comment I would make there is that it's a bit of a defeatist comment, but it's like we can't change our planning laws and legislations and processes fast enough to be able to do this stuff at the scale that we need to. You know, in my community, for example, we were wrestling with what the new flood planning height might be. I think we raised it something like 300 millimetres in the end. I was like, this is absolutely ridiculous, because we can't keep legislative change going at the pace that climate change is escalating. So no, but we need to.
Yeah, I've got a quick one. It's such a great question, and also would support that idea of a possible theme for future events for anyone who's listening there. But I think we're getting a little bit better. I made that comment in my remark earlier that I think we could bring the two responses closer together, and I agree with that comment from Elly as well. I think in the recent experience in Queensland, we saw with the cyclone and a few other things that the ability to get information quickly from our funded NGO sector and from local governments on who was sleeping rough, where they were, how we could get to them quickly, and how we could protect them and things like that actually is moving better than it used to. So I think our systems are getting, I'm just speaking for our context, they're getting a little bit better. But we're not at a point where those two responses work well together, and certainly not at a point where we're actually intentionally planning for it. The one that I always think of is if there's 5 or 6 locations that we know are having this flooding all the time, generally speaking, it's not a technical term, then why isn't there a stockpile of modular housing nearby that we can wheel into town? Why does it take us 6 to 8 to 10 to 12 weeks to get it there? Now, yours is a much more concentrated scenario than that, but I can think of 6 locations in Queensland where we just can't wait to get that stock from Sydney or Melbourne, and the cost is exorbitant to get it up there. So why isn't that kind of already stockpiled? And I think the answer is probably because there's unbelievable unmet demand in every home that we need at the moment we're using. And so that's, of course, the situation that we're in as well. Humair?
Yeah, look, you're right. I mean, we actually in a situation where we are in a BAU situation, we don't have enough housing, right? So thinking ahead and going back to your characterization, that was really good. The critical but not immediate,
Urgent, important, not urgent.
Yeah.
Super important.
So there is no capacity to focus on that because we are still struggling with just providing enough houses for in a normal situation where there is no disaster and there is no climate risk. So I think that is something obviously we need to tackle. And going back to the whole thing of having a pool of properties that can be deployed quickly is very complicated. We've tried it in New South Wales. It's, getting infrastructure on a site, getting land that is not flooded. It's a massive undertaking. So lessons learned from that process that we need to do it differently next time. And you mentioned that in your presentation, Elly, as well. So that's it.
I think we've got, sorry, just again, identify yourself. I think it's Greg, isn't it?
Rob McGorran from a range of things in Melbourne. But there's been a lot of discussion about legacy and some quite interesting discussions around pipeline, I suppose, particularly through the discussions on the, housing. And Elly's flagged the known unknowns. I wonder about whether, in the information that's been put today, what's clear is we're not thinking enough about runway housing. Forget the legacy stuff. Like the evidence is saying there's a lot of displacement that's going to happen based on previous advice. So I'm interested to see what can be brought into the discussion in places of risk, in the Olympics, we're having a big debate in Victoria about the housing towers, etc. But it's really about this idea of, well, what are we doing in the runway to address this so that we're not creating misery along the way?
So, such a great question, really well framed, and I think our first response would be that we see legacy on the front end of the games as much as on the back end. So I think certainly not. And when we first started looking at the report, one of the risks we flagged was people will sort of chip away at it and say, well, hold on, we've got an immediate problem right now. Why we focus so far off in the future? I think we have to assume that we can do both, though, and probably the latter is because we don't want to end up in the same situation we're in now again. So that's what I'd make the case in terms of the longer term legacy. But in terms of legacy on the front side of the games, I couldn't agree more. And in terms of pipeline in Queensland, there are some positive things that are happening. Our government's committed to a significant amount of capex and funding in the budget and the forward estimates, but for the first time ever, they've committed beyond that. So in Queensland, and it's probably been mentioned in this conference, we've got an allocation of funding for social and affordable housing right out to 2044 with the Treasury commitment there. So that's a real firm commitment on a longer term pipeline, and allows the government to contract and do things in very different ways to get more surety into the system and create a significant pipeline. We also have two targets, one for market housing and one for non-market housing. 1 million homes by 2044 and 53,500 social and community homes in Queensland. So they are two really good policy responses. Our biggest challenge at the moment, which I think we're all feeling, is the traditional construction sector being able to meet that demand and capacity. And I'm all ears on people's ideas on how we can do more in that space. For us, how that manifests, we need 50,000 new units of accommodation every year in Queensland, and we're knocking out 35,000, so we're 15,000 behind every year. So that's what we're up against. So it's a very well made point.
I don't know, I feel like I just want to talk about a little bit about a reverse runway. So in the regional context that I'm talking about, I'm really passionate about it not seeing us have a net loss of housing stock. And I think that in the context of disasters and disruption, we have to really care for the people who are at risk of homelessness, who are living in houses that are not being maintained properly, and like, you know, in Lismore, next massive disaster, uninsured, fragile houses, we're going to see a whole new cohort become homeless as a result of that event. So I really want us to think about how we protect and strengthen the housing stock that we have, as well as focusing on developing and building new housing stock, particularly in regional contexts.
We've got a few more minutes before we finish, otherwise I'm in danger of having to do Islands in the Stream with Michael Lennon, who's just come back in. I don't want to do that. Over here, did Angela have is it from Better Renting? Sorry, Alex from Better Renting. And then, so just behind you, back up there. And then we'll go across to the lady who will do Islands in the Stream with Michael if I'm not, if I don't get enough questions.
So Engeler from Better Renting, but speaking a little bit as well from a public health background from my work at Asthma Australia. And really just noting, I think we hear so much, when we do talk about housing and climate risks, it is often this disaster framing, but a lot of the kind of compounding and sequential events we're facing are more slow onset and chronic. So where I live on the south coast of New South Wales, we had months of bushfire smoke into flooding rains, heavy rainfall, COVID, mould epidemic. And for people with chronic diseases like asthma, this is, you know, just over and over again being impacted, and they experience these impacts in home. So I guess my question is around, you know, and the Adapt New South Wales Forum last year had very little focus on housing or health. So I would love to see a focus here on that in terms of climate at the next conference. But yeah, I think my question is just picking up on what you said, Elly, like, are we doing enough to make sure homes are truly climate resilient when we're doing this rebuild work? And what else can we do to protect people like renters, you know, from these chronic and slow onset climate impacts that we're already experiencing, that are already causing displacement for those who are privileged enough to move, but leaving behind those who can't?
Yeah, it's a really wicked problem. It's been fascinating for me to be at this conference and to be thinking from that climate justice lens of, you know, and because our purpose is we exist to try to prevent and mitigate the slide for regional and disaster impacted communities or vulnerable communities living with compounding climate impacts no matter where they live. I raised it in some forum at one point. I was like, but what about the people what can we do about the homes where people are living with the context of private rental markets primarily? And the response I got back from the minister at the time was, oh, well, we can't, you know, put any funding into that because those are private assets. And that just doesn't make sense to me. I would really love us to see some policy response that looks at how we protect the people that are in the homes where they're living so that we can all try to live through this stuff collectively together.
So a question from the audience. Just again, say who you are and who you'd like the question to be addressed to.
Kia ora e te whanau, ko Jill Takunga. My name is Jill Brown. I'm from the Dunedin City Council in New Zealand. We are a Tier 2 city, so we are not a big city, and we have about, to put it in context, we have about a third of the houses and homes that are under 50 centimetres above sea level in the country, which obviously leads us to some significant risk, and yeah, we have considerable worries, and because we're such a small city, we don't garner a huge amount of funding or attention from national government, and that wasn't based on the colour of the government, it was just on the central government. My question is, we want people to be, as a council, we want people to be aware of the climate concerns that we have, and we are doing a huge amount of work to address that, but we also don't want to scare people. There's got to be a fine balance. How do we actually manage that as a council and not lose that social equity that we've got in trust and so on, but still identify to people, hey, we're in a big power storm right now and we need to be doing some stuff.
Great question. Anyone on the panel? I want to take the question about fear is a terrible motivator, so who would like to start with?
I think you're right, and you have the responsibility to inform people of the risk, of course, but then you don't want to impact house values. I mean, the issues that I see constantly, even when flood maps are released by council, suddenly there's an, uproar and people are really angry that suddenly because of this new flood map, my value of my house has gone down. So it is a difficult space to navigate. Like, where do you strike the balance? Like, you are obliged, to provide safety information to people, like, don't build in this floodplain. Like, you have to provide that information, but how do you manage other unintended consequences? So I don't have an answer, but I think I think being transparent and providing the information is better than not providing it. And then you deal with the consequences later. I think the other issues can be managed, but this is a safety issue, so you have to be very upfront about it, I think. Yeah.
I think we need to be really frank with folks. Like, fear is a healthy emotion. Fear can drive you to take actions to protect your life. Let's not be scared of having scary conversations. I think we need to face the challenge head on so that people can prepare themselves as best they can.
Thank you. We're wrapping up now. Just as we finally finish, I'll put to the panel, Elly, Jackson, Humair, what's one thing, one word, one theme that you think that this group should know, that we used to be an unknown and should be now a known that they can take away from the Uhuru conference? So happy to start with any of you.
Oh, I just think, for me, housing is a very real part of major events, housing considerations. And, if you're going to have a massive event like the Olympic and Paralympic Games, you need to have a housing legacy plan alongside it.
I would just say, I feel like I've been a bit of a portender of doom on this panel, but, hope. Let's not lose sight of hope and the incredible action that can come when we all collectively put our shoulders to the same wheel. So let's be hopeful as we face our futures.
And I think, I would say that especially when you're doing large-scale renewals, you're creating suburbs, you're creating environments that is a legacy, and it is a long-term legacy because these are massive undertakings. You are probably changing the structure of the community, you're changing the spatial structure of a suburb. You have to do it very sensitively. Because, that is a legacy that will last for years beyond that, and people will be living in those areas. So factoring in the benefits that will all stakeholders will derive from that redevelopment or renewal is really important. Of course, there are always losers and winners in any such large undertaking, even for Olympics, I'm sure. When, these things happen, there are always winners and losers, but how can you maximize the number of winners out of that and really create a legacy that you can be proud of going forward?
I know that we've run out of time. If for whatever reason we didn't get to people's questions, I know the panel are around at lunchtime, which we'll go to now. But ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in thanking Jackson, Elly and Humair? Thank you.